Well, while the gold rush was going on and Americans were rapidly expanding their way into California, there was American expansion of another kind going on across the Pacific Ocean in Japan, actually. Now, Japan had at this time, we're talking about circa 1850, for about 250 years, Japan had been isolated since Tokugawa Ieyasu had assumed the shogunate and united the country together under his bakufu, or his government, his military government. Japan was closed off to outsiders. Only a handful of non-Japanese people were allowed to enter, and that was only in the southernmost island of the archipelago that is Japan. And there wasn't a whole lot of intermixture or trade with anyone else. And at this same time, mid 19th century, Britain and France and other European countries were starting to make inroads into China. And there was a big competition to see who could convince the government of Japan to open up for trade and other interaction. Well, the U.S. decided to do that by sending warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry. That's him on the left. And next to that is an image by a Japanese artist, their version of him. This is not the Matthew Perry that starred on Friends. It was a different Matthew Perry. So he showed up in 1852 with these warships, modern warships, which Japan did not have, and in fact demonstrated the capability of their cannon by firing some of them off. And essentially said, yeah, so we're going to come back in a bit, and when we do, you're going to do business with us. And 2 years later, they returned, and the Japanese government had decided that it was in their best interest, in their people's best interests, not to challenge the U.S. militarily, because they weren't prepared to do such a thing, having been isolated for so long. And so they did open up for trade. And the guy on the right there, Townsend Harris, was the first American diplomat assigned to Japan. And of course, you can learn all about this in our class on the history of Japan, which I co-teach. The important thing to know in terms of this course is that this was the first sort of international presence that the U.S. Established, basically strong-arming the people of Japan into opening up for trade with them. Now, the U.S. government was also wanting to expand southward, particularly plantation owners and politicians from the south, southward into this region here that is depicted within a green circle. This area was called the Golden Circle at the time. It was an area that included the American South and eastern Mexico, actually all of the rest of Central America, and all of the Caribbean. It was highly coveted because it was very, very conducive to agriculture, particularly the plantation system, primarily sugar, though also coffee and other crops, even in some cases cotton. So a lot of Southerners wanted to see the U.S. expand and take over territory in that golden circle. If you will note, if you'll stop and think for a moment, when we discuss the Compromise of 1820, there concerning Missouri, when that imaginary horizontal line was drawn across the length of the United States, the breadth rather of the United States, and everything below that line you could have slavery. Well, everything in this circle, at least the land masses, are below that line. Therefore, any of these places that could be brought in as territories and eventually as states would be slave territory, slave states. If they became states eventually, then you would have pro-slavery senators and representatives from them. So this is something that was a goal of a lot of Southerners and their Northern politician allies. In 1854, 3 U.S. diplomats met in Belgium, in the city of Ostend, to discuss plans to acquire Cuba. And they drafted up a report of their meeting to turn into their superiors. One of these 3 was the Northern politician James Buchanan, who would be president of the United States just a couple of years after this. He was the ambassador to Great Britain. Also present were the U.S. ambassador to Spain, Pierre Soulet, and the U.S. ambassador to France, John Y. Mason. So they had this meeting, and the recommendation that they came up with was to offer to buy Cuba from Spain. Spain was the colonial owner of Cuba and had been since the time of Columbus. Offer to buy it, but if they don't agree to sell, go to war with Spain and take it away, which was exactly what they had done with Mexico not long before this in order to take all that territory away from Mexico. Now, unfortunately, this report that they drafted up and made copies of wound up in the wrong hands and made its way to the press, who had a field day with this very kind of cloak and dagger sort of subterfuge, secret planning type thing, essentially laying out in advance they were going to make up an excuse to go to war with Spain to take Cuba away from them, which made the U.S. government look bad to its own citizens and prevented them from doing that, right? Because the cat was out of the bag. But that is how determined that the U.S. government was, and many others in the U.S., to gain control of Cuba and the enormous wealth that was being generated there. Sometimes the Americans who were involved in plots to seize land south of the border within this golden circle were not officially representatives of the U.S. government. Sometimes they were independent operatives, mercenaries even, who were leading expeditions to try to capture parts of Mexico, to try to capture various Central American countries. The idea being that if they could do that and sort of lay claim to it and take control, they could then turn it over to the United States. It could be annexed and become a U.S. territory, and eventually perhaps a U.S. state. Now, this is what happened with California, if you will recall. The people who did this were called filibusters. In fact, that was also a verb describing this type of activity, trying to seize land in Latin America so as to cede it to the United States. This comes from the Spanish word filibustero, which in itself is a sort of a Spanish version of a Dutch word, vrijbuiter, which could also be translated into English as freebooter. Booty, or free bootier in the sense of, not like a booty call, but booty in the term of treasure. So freebooters, pirates, except they weren't at sea. They were on land. They were land pirates. What does that even mean? Well, what is a pirate? A pirate is someone who does not operate under the flag of any country and who seizes treasure or seizes various things they're not entitled to and take it for their own. Land pirates, that's where the term filibuster comes from when referencing holding the floor in discussion in Congress, which is probably how you associate the word filibuster. This meaning came first. So eventually that term started being applied in Congress because a person who takes the floor and refuses to give it back and keeps it beyond the time he should really be entitled to it is seizing it like he were a pirate. That's the idea, and just holding on to it. So the image here, by the way, is of a filibuster land pirate from a western called Dead Man's Walk. That's the only land pirate I could think of in cinema, so I used his picture here. Now I'm going to tell you about a famous filibustero, Narciso Lopez. Narciso Lopez was from Cuba. Actually, I think he had been born in Venezuela. But he was, I think, a minor government official in Cuba who sort of fell out with the Spanish overlords of Cuba, essentially. And from criticizing them and so forth, he had to flee for his life from Cuba to the United States. He was a Cuban refugee, except it was not in the 1950s, it was in the 1850s. And in the United States, he started organizing other groups of Cuban refugees who were opposed to the Spanish control of Cuba to try to go back to Cuba and start a revolution. He made 3 attempts, the third one being the biggest one. That was in 1851. And that third attempt, he was actually financed by certain wealthy Americans from the South. One of the people who contributed money to the army of Narciso Lopez was the senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, who 10 years later would be president of the Confederacy. So clearly it fell within the goals of those prominent Southerners for Lopez to go and overthrow the Spanish and create Cuba as an independent country, perhaps with the goal of then overthrowing Lopez and taking it for the United States. At the very least, having helped to finance the revolution, the thought was that they would be able to benefit from the lucrative sugar trade once the Spanish were out of it. So he took his group of Spanish refugees, landed in Cuba, with the idea that once he landed with his small army, all the people of Cuba would rally to his cause and join his army, and then that would swell the size of his forces enough that they could overthrow the Spanish. And if that sounds vaguely familiar, the same thing happened 110 years later in the early 1960s when the U.S., the CIA specifically, financed Cuban refugees who tried to land in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, hoping to start a revolution to overthrow Castro. In both cases, it did not work. Turns out, Cuban people, not unlike other people, don't like to get shot. And the odds were very largely against them, so they did not rally around the banner of Narciso Lopez any more than they did in the 1960s. And he was captured and executed. However, interesting side point, the flag of the army of Narciso Lopez, which is shown there, 100 years later, when the Cuban Revolution occurred and Fidel Castro took over the country, This became the official flag of the nation of Cuba, which it still remains. So, as I've said before, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Here is another famous filibuster, William Walker of Hendersonville, Tennessee, known to the press as the Gray-Eyed Man of Destiny, frequently appearing in newspapers due to his repeated efforts to carve up some land south of the border to tender back to the United States. His first filibuster attempts were in Baja California, there in the northwestern part of Mexico. Those didn't work. However, his efforts to conquer Nicaragua in 1856 did work. His private army did succeed in taking over the country and establishing him as president of Nicaragua, which means that you can add him to the list of American presidents, which of course are Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Andrew Johnson, and Sam Houston, who became president of Texas, and now William Walker, president briefly of Nicaragua. I say briefly, less than a year, about 10 months, before the people of Nicaragua were able to rise up and chase him out of Nicaragua. Then, 3 years later, 1860, he tried again and landed this time in Honduras. And actually, it wasn't just the people of Nicaragua. They were allied with various other Central American countries, all of whom recognized the threat of William Walker and people like him. He was defeated by an alliance of Central American countries in Honduras in 1860, and in September of 1860, 2 months before Abraham Lincoln was elected president, William Walker was executed in Honduras. That then was the situation in the 1850s and demonstrates the lengths to which Southerners would go in order to expand U.S. territory and thereby open up new areas to expand the reach of cotton. Now remember, cotton, which was being grown heavily throughout the first half of the 19th century after the invention of the cotton gin, heavily in the deep South, all the way from South Carolina down to Texas, that wide swath through there. Cotton was dominating the economy, dominating the agricultural landscape. And if cotton is grown repeatedly in the same fields without resting those fields, without rotating the crops, it depletes the soil of the nutrients needed to produce cotton. Now, anybody that had any forethought would realize if you have some land where you're growing cotton, you can't grow it there every single year. You have to take a year off in all your various fields. But cotton was making so much money. Nobody wanted to lose the money of not growing cotton another year. So they were wearing out the soil in the deep South. And the only way they could continue producing the amount of cotton that they were was to get access to new lands, to move farther west and potentially, with the help of filibusters, they hoped southward into the Caribbean and Central America, so that they could maintain their economic position and their political position, because, you know, the fact that they had slavery and they were able to count 3/5 of those slaves toward their population, even though those slaves weren't citizens, had given them a disproportionate amount of power in Congress and allowed them basically to dominate the government. If that's going to continue, then slavery and cotton, they believed, had to continue growing westward. And if it were confined to the states where it already existed and not allowed to spread, then they would slowly see their power and their finances shrivel up and die. So there was a lot at stake for those who benefited the most from cotton agriculture and therefore from slavery.